Imagine watching your family go hungry in February because you didn't plant the right seeds in October. Sounds dramatic, right? Well, it's not. Our grandparents knew something modern gardeners have completely forgotten. October wasn't the end of the growing season. It was when survival really began. And today, I'm going to show you the 20 crops our grandparents planted every single October to make it through brutal winters when stores were empty and money was gone. If you've ever wondered how families survived months of snow and freezing temperatures without grocery stores, this is the video you've been waiting for. And trust me, number 3 is a crop that could literally feed your family for an entire year from just one October planting. You don't want to miss it. Now, let's get into it. Danvers and Chantenay carrots. Danvers and Chantenay carrots planted in late summer were still in the ground come October, and our grandparents weren't in any hurry to pull them. Instead, they'd pile straw or leaves a foot deep over the rows, marking the ends with stakes so they could find them under snow. This mulch kept the ground from freezing solid, letting them dig carrots all winter long. The cold storage in the ground was better than any root cellar. Carrots stayed crisp and sweet, actually improving in flavor as cold temperatures converted starches to sugars. When they needed carrots in January, they'd shovel snow off the mulch, peel back the protective layer, and dig as many as they needed for that week. Then they'd cover everything back up. It was a live root cellar that required no basement space and kept carrots fresher than any box of sand could. The downside was that once the ground froze too hard to dig, you were done until the spring thaw. So experienced gardeners would pull some to store indoors, but leave plenty in the ground for that superior flavor and texture that only winter soil could provide. Winter onions, multiplier onions, and Egyptian walking onions were the workhorses of the October garden. These weren't your standard bulb onions. These were perennials that came back year after year, multiplying underground and producing greens long before spring onions even germinated. Our grandparents planted sets or divisions in fall, knowing that mild varieties could overwinter even in harsh climates. They'd separate clustered bulbs from established plants and replant them in rich soil, spacing them about 4 inches apart. The sets would root in before hard frost, then sit dormant until late winter when they'd start growing again under snow. Egyptian walking onions were even stranger, producing bulbils at the top of their stalks that would bend over, plant themselves, and literally walk across the garden over the years. Both types gave fresh onion flavor when nothing else was growing. Greens could be cut repeatedly without killing the plant. The multiplying bulbs meant they never had to buy onion sets again. For families watching every penny, these self-perpetuating onions were insurance against hunger and a reminder that smart planting in fall paid dividends for years. Garlic. Our grandparents didn't wait for spring to plant garlic. Every October, while the ground was still workable, they'd break apart the biggest, healthiest heads from last year's harvest and push individual cloves 3 inches deep into prepared beds. The timing was critical. Plant too early and shoots might emerge before winter, getting killed by frost. Plant too late and the roots wouldn't establish before the ground froze solid. They chose spots with full sun and excellent drainage because waterlogged garlic rotted before spring. Each clove went in pointy end up, spaced about 6 inches apart in rows. Then came a thick blanket of straw or leaves, protecting against freeze-thaw cycles that could heave bulbs right out of the ground. Through the coldest months, those cloves sat dormant, sending down roots in the dark while snow covered everything. Come spring, they'd be the first green shoots pushing through, weeks ahead of anything planted after thaw. By early summer, they'd harvest heads twice the size of store-bought garlic, with flavors so intense they made every meal taste better. That fall planting transformed a simple crop into survival food that lasted until the next harvest. Spinach, fall-sown spinach, was a game-changer. Our grandparents would broadcast seeds across prepared beds in late October, sometimes even into early November if the weather held. The seeds would germinate quickly in cool soil, sending down roots and forming small rosettes before winter shut everything down. Those tough little plants would sit frozen solid all winter, looking dead but very much alive. The magic happened in late winter and early spring when temperatures rose just enough for growth to resume. Those established roots gave spinach a massive head start over spring-planted crops. By the time neighbors were just planting seeds in April, our grandparents were already harvesting handfuls of tender, sweet leaves. They knew to plant thick because not every seed would make it through winter. They also knew to choose cold, hardy varieties like Bloomsdale, which handled frost better than modern hybrids. Some folks even scattered seeds in cold frames or against south-facing walls where microclimates offered extra protection. The spinach that survived winter was sweeter too, having converted starches to sugars as a natural antifreeze. Kale, Siberian, and winter-boar kale varieties were bred for exactly what their name suggested: surviving winter. Our grandparents planted these in October because they knew frost actually improved the flavor, breaking down bitter compounds and making leaves sweeter and more tender. These weren't the delicate salad greens modern gardeners coddle. These were tough, frost-hardy plants that laughed at the weather that killed everything else. They'd transplant seedlings started in late summer or direct sow seeds in early October, spacing plants about 18 inches apart. The goal was to establish them with good root systems before the hard freezes arrived. Throughout November, December, and sometimes into January, these plants continued to produce. Snow would bury them completely, but when it melted, there they'd be, still green and edible. Our grandparents would trudge out in winter boots, brush snow off the plants, and harvest leaves for dinner that same night. Some varieties survived temperatures well below zero. They'd mulch heavily around the base for extra protection, but these plants were tough enough to handle themselves. Rye and clover. This might seem odd in a list of survival crops, but our grandparents understood that survival wasn't just about this year's food. It was about next year's soil and the livestock that would feed them year-round. After harvesting summer gardens, they'd broadcast winter rye and crimson clover across empty beds, letting these cover crops work all winter and spring. Rye put down massive root systems that broke up compacted soil, pulled nutrients from deep layers, and prevented erosion. Clover fixed nitrogen from the air, enriching the soil better than any fertilizer they could afford. Together, these crops suppressed weeds and added organic matter when they were turned under in the spring. But there was more. In desperate times, winter rye could be grazed by livestock, providing fresh forage when hay ran low. The mature grain could even be harvested and ground into flour, although it was tough and resulted in dense, dark bread. Some families kept chickens specifically on cover crop areas, letting them scratch through and eat seeds and greens all winter. Turnips, purple top, and golden ball turnips were planted in October for a late fall harvest that would store through winter. Loved these because they grew fast and handled cool soil better than most crops, and they'd be ready to pull before the ground froze solid. They'd plant seeds directly, scattering them in rows and thinning seedlings to 3 inches apart once they sprouted. 6 weeks after planting, they'd have turnips ready to harvest. The roots pulled easily from loose October soil, and after brushing off dirt, they'd be stored in barrels of sand in the root cellar. The greens were just as valuable as the roots, harvested young and cooked like spinach. These greens came at a time when gardens were mostly finished, providing fresh food in November when everything else was already stored. Turnips weren't glamorous, many people didn't even like them much, but they filled bellies, stored reliably, and could be stretched into soups and stews that fed large families on very little. Rutabagas were the turnip's tougher, bigger cousin, and they stored even better through winter. The grandparents planted them in October for harvest in late November or early December, after the first frosts sweetened them up. These dense, yellow-fleshed roots could sit in a cold cellar for months without rotting, making them critical survival food when nothing fresh was available. They needed richer soil than turnips and a bit more space, so plants were thinned to 6 inches apart. The long growing season meant October-planted rutabagas would still be maturing when snow started flying, but they could handle frost that would damage other root crops. Our grandparents would pull them just before the ground froze too hard to dig, twist off the tops, and store them in barrels or bins layered with straw. By February, when stored potatoes were getting soft and sprouting, rutabagas were still firm and fresh. They'd be cubed for stews, mashed like potatoes, or roasted near the fire. Beets. Detroit dark red and Cylindra beets went into root cellars by the hundreds, stored in boxes of damp sand that kept them fresh for months. Planted them in late summer and harvested them in October after a few light frosts sweetened them up. These varieties store reliably, and beets pack more nutrition per pound than almost any other storage crop. They'd twist off the tops, leaving about an inch of stem to prevent bleeding, then layer them in wooden boxes, alternating beets with damp sand. Stored in a cool, dark cellar, they'd last until March or April. The greens were harvested separately and cooked fresh or preserved. Throughout winter, our grandparents would head down cellar and pull out beets for pickling, roasting, or adding to soups. The deep red color made winter food look more appealing, and the natural sugars in beets made even plain meals taste better. During hard times when meat was scarce and store-bought food was a luxury, beets filled the gap with vitamins, minerals, and enough calories to keep people working through brutal winters. Parsnips. Here's the crop that actually needed frost to taste good. Our grandparents planted parsnips in spring, let them grow all summer, then left them in the ground through winter. October frost was when parsnips transformed from woody and bitter to sweet and almost nutty. They'd mulch them heavily in October, then dig them anytime the ground wasn't frozen solid. Some families left them in the ground until spring, pulling them in March or April when few other vegetables were available. That long, cold exposure made them incredibly sweet, almost like they'd been candied. Our grandparents would dig them on January thaw days, finding roots that had survived under snow and ice for months. They'd roast them near the fire, boil them for mash, or add them to stews where their sweetness balanced out salted meat and bitter greens. Parsnips were proof that patience paid off. They required a full year of planting, plant in spring, ignore all summer, harvest in winter. Cabbage. Late flat Dutch and Savoy cabbages were the workhorses of the October harvest and winter storage. Our grandparents planted them in the summer and harvested them in October after the frost improved their flavor. These massive heads, some weighing 15 pounds or more, were taken straight to the root cellar or processed into sauerkraut that would feed the family until spring. For cellar storage, they'd pull entire plants, roots and all, and hang them upside down from ceiling beams in the coolest part of the basement. Or they'd wrap individual heads in newspaper and pack them in barrels. Some families dug pits outside, lined them with straw, and buried cabbages under layers of straw and soil, creating outdoor cold storage that kept perfectly all winter. But the real survival food was sauerkraut. October was kraut-making time, when women would shred hundreds of pounds of cabbage, layer it with salt in large crocks, and let it ferment. Brussels sprouts. While everyone knows Brussels sprouts as a cold weather crop, most don't realize they actually thrive in fall and improve dramatically after frost. Our grandparents planted them in the summer, let them develop slowly through fall, and harvested from October through December. These plants would stand in the garden through snow and ice, producing fresh vegetables when almost nothing else would. The trick was knowing that Brussels sprouts needed time to develop and frost to sweeten. Our grandparents wouldn't even bother harvesting until after several hard freezes turned the bitter little cabbages into sweet, nutty treats. They'd head out in November with a basket, snap off sprouts from the bottom of stalks upward, and leave plants standing for next time. Some varieties could handle temperatures down to 20 degrees, and a few hardy types would produce into January. For fresh vegetables in the dead of winter, Brussels sprouts were unmatched. They'd be boiled, roasted near the fire, or added to stews. Radishes. Winter radishes, like black Spanish, weren't the little red salad radishes modern gardeners know. These were big, tough storage roots planted in October for a late fall harvest. Our grandparents valued them because they grew fast, handled cold soil perfectly, and stored in root cellars for months without shriveling or going soft. They'd sow seeds in early October, sometimes even broadcasting them across empty beds after summer crops finished. 6 to 8 weeks later, they'd harvest roots the size of turnips. These had tough skin, often black or purple, and dense white flesh with a sharp, peppery bite. They weren't eaten raw like salad radishes. They were sliced thin and added to soups, grated for relishes, or pickled in vinegar. Stored in barrels of sand, they'd last until March. During hard winters, when root cellar supplies ran low, these storage radishes filled the gap between running out of everything else and the spring harvest. Leeks. Here's the crop our grandparents planted and then forgot about until they needed it. Leeks went into the ground in summer, grew slowly through fall, then overwintered right where they were planted. October was when they'd hill soil up around the stems, blanching them white and protecting them for winter harvesting. Through December, January, and even February, our grandparents would head out with a spading fork and dig leeks as needed. The freeze-thaw cycles didn't harm them. Snow didn't hurt them. They just sat there waiting to be harvested, like a living refrigerator in the garden. They'd pull enough for a week's worth of soup, brush off the snow and frozen soil, and head inside to cook them. Leeks added flavor to bland winter meals, making salt pork and potatoes taste like real food again. Some families would dig all their leeks in late fall and replant them in deep trenches filled with leaves or straw, creating easier access during deep winter. Collard greens. Down south, collards were the green that never quit. Up north, they were a revelation for families who learned about them from southern neighbors or seed catalogs. Our grandparents would plant them in late summer and let them grow into fall, knowing these tough plants would handle frosts that killed everything else. The plants would sit through November, December, and sometimes into January, producing fresh leaves the entire time. Frost actually improved their flavor, reducing bitterness and making them sweet enough to eat with minimal seasoning. Our grandparents would break off the lower leaves while letting the center continue to grow, allowing for multiple harvests from a single plant. On bitterly cold days, they'd head out bundled up, snap off a few pounds of leaves, and bring them in for slow cooking. They were also incredibly productive, with a single plant producing pounds of greens over months of harvest. Swiss chard. Ford Hook Giant and other hardy chard varieties were planted in late summer and produced into December and beyond in many climates. Our grandparents valued chard because it kept giving even after repeated hard frosts, and unlike many greens, both the leaves and thick stems were edible. They'd plant it in August or September, let it establish good roots before cold weather, then harvest leaves throughout fall and early winter. The outer leaves were cut while the center kept growing, providing fresh greens for months. Some families would mulch chard heavily in October, extending harvest another month or two. The thick white stems were used like celery in soups and stews, while the large leaves were cooked like spinach. In milder climates, heavily mulched chard would sometimes survive all winter and resume growth in spring, giving 2 seasons of harvest from one planting. Mustard greens. Fast-growing and incredibly cold-hardy, mustard greens planted in October would be ready to harvest in 6 weeks or less. Our grandparents used them to fill the gap between fall harvest and winter storage crops, getting fresh food from the garden well into November and even December in milder areas. These greens handled light frosts easily and actually tasted better after cold weather mellowed their spicy bite. They'd broadcast seeds across empty beds after pulling summer crops, then thin seedlings to about 6 inches apart. Some folks succession planted every 2 weeks through October, ensuring a continuous harvest until hard freezes shut everything down. Mustard greens were cooked like collards or spinach, providing a strong flavor that made bland winter meals taste better. They were also packed with vitamins at a time when nutrition was hard to come by. Dandelion Greens. Modern people spend fortunes trying to kill dandelions. Our grandparents cultivated them on purpose. They'd either plant improved varieties with larger, less bitter leaves, or they'd manage wild patches, encouraging the best plants and eliminating the worst. Fall was when they'd harvest dandelion roots to force for winter greens, digging them in October and replanting in boxes of soil in the root cellar or near the warmest part of the house. These forced dandelions would produce blanched leaves throughout winter, providing fresh greens when nothing outside was growing. The roots were also roasted and ground as a coffee substitute during hard times when real coffee was unaffordable. Spring dandelions were harvested young before flowers appeared, when leaves were still tender and only mildly bitter. They'd be cooked with bacon fat and vinegar, making a tonic that was believed to cleanse the blood after a long winter of heavy food. Dandelions cost nothing, grew everywhere, and provided food and medicine when store-bought greens weren't an option. Parsley and chives. Herbs, parsley, and chives planted in fall would survive most winters, especially when given simple protection. Our grandparents would plant them in October near the house or in cold frames, knowing these hardy herbs would provide fresh flavoring through winter and be the first greens to come up in spring. This seems like a luxury until you realize how miserable winter food tasted without any seasoning. Parsley was particularly hardy, surviving snow and ice under a thick mulch of leaves or straw. Chives were even tougher, dying back to the ground but surviving underground and sprouting again in spring. Some families would pot up divisions and bring them indoors, keeping them on sunny windowsills for fresh onion flavor all winter. During hard times when meat was scarce and meals were repetitive, these herbs made the difference between food that was merely fuel and food that tasted like someone cared. They also had medicinal uses, with parsley believed to aid digestion and chives thought to support health. Winter wheat. Here's the crop that required the most faith and the least work. Our grandparents would plant winter wheat seed across fields or garden plots in October, sometimes even into November. Those seeds would germinate quickly in cool soil, sending down roots and sprouting small green shoots before winter shut everything down. Come spring, that wheat would green up weeks before spring-planted grain, giving it a massive head start on the growing season. By early summer, the seeds planted in October would be ready to harvest, providing grain that could be ground into flour for bread or fed to livestock as whole kernels. This was survival food in its purest form, planted in fall, ignore it all winter, harvest in summer. The grain stored for years if kept dry, providing the foundation for meals that sustained families when everything else ran out. During the worst times, when money was gone and stores were empty, families lived on bread made from wheat they'd planted themselves the previous October. Which of these October plantings are you going to try this fall? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, leave this video a hype, and see you on the next one.